At a small truck stop diner on Route 66, 95-year-old Henry Williams sits alone, counting change for a cup of coffee, while a group of truckers mock his threadbare coat and worn-out shoes. When one of them suggests he's probably another homeless vet looking for handouts, Henry quietly removes an ancient gold ring from his pocket, catching the eye of Sarah Mitchell, a historian dining nearby. She recognizes the ring's crest immediately. It belongs to one of Boston's oldest families, believed to have died out in the 1960s, but the truth about Henry's identity and why he's spent 30 years living in poverty despite being heir to a $300 million fortune will reveal a devastating story of sacrifice, lost love, and a promise that changed two families forever. Like and subscribe to follow this heartbreaking tale of how one man chose honor over wealth and why some debts can only be repaid by keeping silent. The fluorescent lights of Pete's Highway Diner cast harsh shadows across Henry Williams' weathered face as he carefully counted out quarters and dimes for a cup of coffee. His hands, still steady despite his age, moved methodically across the scratched Formica counter. 75 cents, 85. He murmured, his voice barely audible above the rumble of passing trucks outside. Behind him, 3 truckers at a corner booth snickered. "Look at that!" one said loudly. "Probably spent his social security check on booze again." Henry ignored them, the way he'd learned to ignore so much over the decades. The pitying looks, the whispered comments, the assumptions about why a man his age would be alone at a truck stop diner at 9 p.m., wearing clothes that had seen better days. Sally, the night waitress who'd worked at Pete's for 20 years, approached with the coffee pot. "Put your money away, Mr. Henry," she said softly. "This one's on me." "No, thank you," Henry replied with quiet dignity. "I can pay my own way." He finally assembled the correct change, sliding it across the counter with careful precision. At a nearby table, Sarah Mitchell looked up from her laptop where she'd been working on her latest book about Boston's historic families. Something about the old man's voice, his bearing despite the shabby clothes, caught her attention. The truckers weren't finished. The largest one, emboldened by his friend's laughter, stood up and approached Henry. "Hey, Gramps, that coat looks pretty thin. Want to hear about this great shelter in town? They specialize in helping vets who can't take care of themselves anymore." Henry took a slow sip of his coffee before responding. "I appreciate your concern, young man, but I'm quite capable of taking care of myself." "Sure you are," the trucker smirked. "That's why you're counting pennies for coffee. Bet you've got some great war stories too, right? Probably stormed the beaches at Normandy." His tone made it clear he didn't believe Henry was really a veteran. "Actually," Henry said quietly, "I served in Korea. 2nd Infantry Division. But that was a long time ago." "Korea?" The trucker laughed. "Man, you really commit to your stories, don't you? How about you show us some proof, old-timer?" Henry's hand moved to his pocket, where he kept the only thing of value he still owned. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled out an ancient gold ring. "This was my grandfather's," he said. "He gave it to me before I shipped out, said it would bring me luck." Sarah Mitchell's coffee cup clattered against her saucer as she caught sight of the ring. She knew that crest, had spent years researching it for her book. The intertwined W and C surrounded by ivy leaves, the Latin motto, Fides et Honor, faith and honor. It was the Whitmore-Carson family ring, passed down through one of Boston's oldest and wealthiest bloodlines. A family that had supposedly died out in the 1960s when the last heir disappeared after a scandal that had rocked New England society. But Sarah knew something the truckers didn't. That ring was impossible to fake. Only 5 had ever been made, and 4 were accounted for in museums or private collections. Which meant... "Excuse me," she said, approaching the counter. "But are you "Are you Henry Whitmore Carson?" The old man's shoulders stiffened slightly, but he didn't turn around. "Nobody's called me that in a very long time, young lady. It's just Henry Williams now." The truckers had fallen silent, sensing something significant was happening. "But you're supposed to be dead," Sarah continued. "The newspapers, they said you died in Korea." Henry's smile was tired and sad. Sometimes it's easier to let people believe what they want to believe, especially when the truth would hurt those you love. But the fortune, the estate, it all went to charity when no heir could be found. "Yes," Henry said simply. "That was the point." Sarah pulled up a stool next to Henry, her historian's mind racing. The truckers, now thoroughly intrigued, had moved closer to listen. "I don't understand," she said. "The Whitmore Carson fortune was estimated at over $300 million. Why would you just walk away from that?" Henry turned the ring over in his weathered hands, the gold catching the diner's fluorescent lights. "Have you ever made a promise that cost you everything?" he asked quietly. "One that you kept, even when keeping it meant losing everything you loved?" Sally brought him a fresh cup of coffee, this time refusing to take his money. The entire diner had fallen silent, waiting for him to continue. "It was 1952, Henry began. "I had just returned from Korea. My grandfather, William Whitmore Carson III, was dying. But before he died, he told me something that changed everything." He paused, taking a careful sip of his coffee. "The Whitmore Carson fortune wasn't built on shipping and real estate like everyone believed. Those were just cover stories. The real money came from something much darker. During World War II, my grandfather had collaborated with Nazi officials, helping them hide stolen art and gold in exchange for a percentage." Sarah gasped. This was explosive historical information. Nothing like this had ever been suspected about the family. By the time he realized the full horror of what he'd done, it was too late. The money was too deeply entangled in the family fortune. But on his deathbed, he made me promise to make it right. "But why not just return the money?" one of the truckers asked, all mockery gone from his voice. Henry shook his head. It wasn't that simple. The fortune had been built on the suffering of Holocaust victims. Simply giving it back wouldn't have been enough. My grandfather believed the family name needed to die out completely, that the Whitmore Carson line needed to end as penance for his sins. "So you faked your death in Korea?" Sarah asked. "No," Henry replied. "The army did that for me. I was badly wounded, listed as KIA for 3 days before they found me. By the time I recovered, I realized it was the perfect opportunity. I could keep my promise to my grandfather. Let the world think the last Whitmore Carson was dead." "But your fiancée," Sarah said, remembering her research, "Elizabeth Bradford." She was devastated. "The papers said she never married, spent the rest of her life mourning you." Henry's hands trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup. That was the hardest part. Lizzie, she deserved better. But I couldn't tell her the truth, couldn't make her complicit in what I had to do. He pulled out an old photograph from his wallet. A beautiful young woman in 1950s dress, smiling at the camera. "I watched her from afar for 50 years, made sure she was taken care of, even if she never knew. When she died in 2003, I was at the funeral, standing in the back, still keeping my promise." The truckers who had mocked him earlier now looked ashamed. One of them wiped his eyes hurriedly with his sleeve. "But why keep living in poverty?" Sarah pressed. "Surely, after all these years." "The promise wasn't just about giving up the money," Henry explained. "It was about living a life of atonement. I took jobs as a janitor, a dishwasher, honest work. Every extra penny I earned went anonymously to Holocaust survivors' charities." He touched the ring gently. "I keep this only to remember, to never forget the price of staying silent in the face of evil, even if that silence happened before I was born." But after all this time, Sarah said, why are you telling us now? Henry studied his coffee cup for a long moment before answering. Because I'm dying, he said simply. Cancer. Doctors give me a few months at most. And I realized there's one last part of my promise I need to fulfill. He carefully unwrapped the ring from the worn handkerchief he kept it in. This ring needs to go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, along with all the documentation I've kept. The world should know the truth, even if it can't change the past. One of the truckers, the one who'd been most aggressive earlier, cleared his throat. Sir, I'm headed to D.C. tomorrow. I'd be honored to help you deliver it. Henry smiled gently. Thank you, son, but this is something I need to do myself. One last journey. Sally, who had been listening while pretending to wipe down tables, spoke up. But how will you get there, Mr. Henry? It's a long way from Oklahoma to Washington. I'll walk if I have to, Henry replied. Been saving up for bus fare, but prices have gone up since I last checked. Sarah closed her laptop decisively. I'm driving to D.C. for a conference. I can take you. No, I couldn't impose. Mr. Whitmore Carson, Sarah interrupted, then corrected herself. Mr. Williams, I've spent my career writing about families like yours, but I never understood until tonight what true nobility really means. Please, let me help you complete your grandfather's promise. The truckers exchanged glances. The leader pulled out his wallet. Here's for your next few meals, sir. And don't you dare refuse. It's not charity. It's respect. Others in the diner started coming forward. A retired couple offered hotel points for his stay in D.C. A young waitress emptied her tip jar. Even the cook came out from the kitchen with a bag of sandwiches for the road. Henry's eyes filled with tears. All these years, he said softly, I've tried to live quietly, to atone for sins that weren't mine. I never expected. That's what makes you a real hero, Sally said firmly. Not the family name or the ring, but 60 years of quiet sacrifice, of keeping a promise no one even knew about. Sarah checked her watch. We should leave early tomorrow, beat the traffic. There's something else you should know, Henry said. In my room at the boarding house, I have journals. Hundreds of pages detailing everything my grandfather told me. Names, dates, places, it's all there. This will change history, Sarah breathed. Rewrite everything we thought we knew about that era. That's why it needs to come out now, Henry replied. The truth may hurt, but secrets hurt more. I've lived with this one long enough. As the diner patrons continued to gather around, offering help and support, no one noticed a man in an expensive suit at a corner booth, speaking urgently into his phone. He had recognized the ring too, and there were people who very much wanted the Whitmore Carson secrets to stay buried. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Henry's boarding house early. It was a modest place on the outskirts of town, the kind of establishment that asked few questions and expected little from its residents. Henry was waiting outside with a small, worn suitcase. Most of it is papers, he explained as she helped him load it into her car. Been keeping them safe all these years. As they pulled away from the boarding house, neither noticed the black SUV that began following them at a discreet distance. Tell me about Elizabeth, Sarah said after they'd been driving for a while. Your fiancée, what was she like? Henry's face softened at the memory. Lizzie was sunshine, laughed at all my bad jokes, wanted to open a bookstore after we got married, said being a society wife wasn't for her. He pulled out the old photograph again. She would have understood, I think, about the promise, about needing to make things right. But I couldn't risk her choosing to throw her life away alongside mine. Did she ever suspect you were alive? Once, Henry admitted, in 1973. I was working as a janitor at Boston General. She came in for a checkup, walked right past me, then stopped, started to turn around. I ducked into a supply closet and waited 2 hours for her to leave. Sarah glanced in her rearview mirror, noticing the black SUV for the first time. I think we're being followed. I expected something like this, Henry said calmly. There are still people who benefit from the old arrangements, people who don't want the truth about wartime collaborators coming out. Should we call the police? Number, just keep driving. I made copies of everything, stored in different places. Even if they stop us, the truth will still come out. The SUV was getting closer. Sarah pressed the accelerator, but on the empty highway there was nowhere to hide. There's something else, Henry said urgently. Something I didn't tell you last night. The journals don't just implicate my grandfather. There are names, powerful families who are still prominent today. Banking dynasties, political families. The SUV was alongside them now. A man in the passenger seat rolled down his window, showing a badge. Federal agents! Pull over! Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Are they really federal agents? Probably, Henry replied, but not the kind that want justice. The SUV started to edge them toward the shoulder. Sarah looked for an escape route, but they were boxed in. Pull over, Henry said softly. I've spent my life running from this. Maybe it's time to face it head on. Sarah reluctantly brought the car to a stop. 2 men in suits approached, one from the front, one from the rear. Mr. Whitmore Carson, the lead agent said, we need you to come with us. Do you have a warrant? Sarah demanded. We don't need one. This is a matter of national security. Henry stepped out of the car, his bearing suddenly regal despite his shabby clothes. You're James Bradford, aren't you? Elizabeth's nephew. You have her eyes. The agent's professional demeanor cracked slightly. Aunt Elizabeth never stopped loving you, never believed you were really dead. I know, Henry said quietly. That's why you're not going to stop me from telling the truth, because she deserves to know why I had to leave, why I had to break her heart to keep my promise. The agent's hand, reaching for his weapon, hesitated. James Bradford stood frozen, his aunt's eyes staring back at him from an old man's face. Finally, he lowered his weapon. I watched her wait for you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Every Christmas she'd set an extra place at dinner. Said sometimes miracles happen if you keep believing. I know, Henry replied. I was there, Jimmy, every Christmas Eve, watching through the window, making sure she was okay, making sure my choice hadn't destroyed her completely. The other agent stepped forward. Sir, our orders. Stand down, Bradford commanded. Then to Henry. The documents you're carrying, they'll ruin a lot of powerful people. They'll reveal the truth, Henry corrected. And the truth is, the only gift I can give Elizabeth now, the only way to explain why I had to break her heart. Sarah, watching from the car, saw the moment Bradford made his decision. We'll escort you to DC, he said. Make sure you get to the Holocaust Museum safely. It's what Aunt Elizabeth would have wanted. The drive to Washington was long, but peaceful. Henry spent much of it telling Bradford stories about Elizabeth, small moments of joy that he'd carried in his heart for decades. Her favorite flowers, daisies, how she took her tea, 2 sugars, no milk, the way she hummed when she was reading. At the Holocaust Museum, historians and curators gathered quickly once they realized what Henry had brought them. The ring, the journals, the documented evidence of wartime collaboration and post-war cover-ups. It was all carefully preserved and catalogued. We'll make sure the truth is told, the head curator promised. All of it. 3 months later, Sarah attended 2 ceremonies. The first was at the museum, where a new exhibition opened, documenting the complex web of wartime collaboration and one family's decades-long journey toward atonement. Henry's ring sat in a central display case, its gold gleaming under careful lighting. The second ceremony was smaller, just a handful of people gathered at a simple grave where Henry Williams, formerly Henry Whitmore Carson, was laid to rest beside Elizabeth Bradford. He had lasted just long enough to see the truth come out, to know his promise had been fully kept. James Bradford arranged for the headstone. It read simply, "Love does not end with death, nor promises with time. Some choices echo through generations until truth and honor are restored." Sarah wrote her book, of course, not just about the Whitmore Carson fortune or the wartime secrets, but about an old man in a truck stop diner who had chosen honor over wealth, truth over comfort, and a lifetime of quiet sacrifice over an easy lie. The truckers who had mocked him that night became regular donors to the Holocaust Museum. Sally retired from the diner, but kept Henry's coffee cup displayed proudly on a shelf above the counter. "To remind folks," she would say, "that you can't judge a book by its cover or a man by his clothes." And in Boston, in the Bradford family home, Elizabeth's Christmas tradition continued. Every year, they set an extra place at dinner, not for a missing love now, but to remember that sometimes the greatest acts of love are the ones no one sees. The choices made in silence, the promises kept in secret. Because Henry Williams had taught them all that true nobility isn't in rings or family names or fortunes. It's in the quiet moments when we choose right over easy, truth over comfort, honor over wealth. His ring sits in the museum, but his real legacy lives on in changed hearts and opened eyes, in the knowledge that one person's choice to do right, no matter the cost, can echo through generations.